CBSE Board, Class 11, History, Chapter 4, Part 3, Audio by Renee Matthew. We had a look on the timeline which is prescribed for this chapter, and there are some tips on timeline which is given towards the end of this session, after which you will see how to make use of the timeline in the proper way. As with all timelines, this particular timeline also focuses on a few dates. There are very important ones, and it's not just enough that you know only these dates, and you need to know the unimportant dates also. And you also have to find out why this timeline just focuses on different types of dates. Only the main ones are focused here in this particular timeline. Now we are going to part 1, that is the first phase of this chapter, the Industrial Revolution. We saw that this chapter is divided into 3 parts. Now we are going to enter the first part, the first phase, the Industrial Revolution. You are very familiar with the Industrial Revolution. You may be thinking why there is a repetition of this topic, but that is one of the causes, that is one of the essential factors which led to modernization. There was a huge transformation which took place, and the economy in Britain actually underwent this transformation, especially between the 1780s and the 1850s, and that is known as the first Industrial Revolution, the first phase. And this had a great far-reaching effect in Britain. Similar changes occurred in European countries and in the USA. Everywhere similar changes took place in these countries. They were to have a major impact on the society, the economy of those countries, and also on the rest of the world. So the changes which took place in these countries had a major impact on the rest of the world also. It started spreading to the other parts of the country also. Now this particular phase of industrial development in Britain is very important because it is related. It is associated with machinery and technology, new machinery and technology, and it made it possible to produce goods on a massive scale. So new machinery and technology, when so much of importance was given, the goods were produced on a massive scale compared to handicraft and handloom industries. Goods were actually produced on a massive scale, especially when it comes to handicrafts and handloom industries, on a very large scale instead of the small scale guild system. This chapter mainly focuses on the changes which took place in the cotton and iron industries. We are going to look into that also. Steam was a new source of power. It was a new mode of invention that the Europeans or the settlers found out, and they began to be used on a very large scale. It was used for faster forms of transportation, especially by ships and railways, and we also know that ship and railway transportation, this led to a huge evolution and revolution in the transportation system which was operating in those days. Many of the inventors and businessmen who brought about these changes were often neither personally wealthy or educated. They did not have any access to education. They were not very wealthy also. They did not have much background in sciences like physics or chemistry. So we can see from glances into the background of some of them, okay, how these people brought about the changes. We can see that they were not very well equipped. Then how did they bring about these changes? That is a curiosity which this particular chapter arouses. So, Industrial Revolution, we saw that it gave a lot of prosperity to different parts of the world, but in the initial stages that was not the case, because the conditions of living was very poor. The working condition was not at all favorable for millions of people, including women and children. They had to adjust and also live in very utter desolation, very unfilthy, you can say, very filthy kind of conditions, very stringent conditions, which was not at all pleasing to the human living conditions, okay, the normal living conditions. They did not have the basic necessities quite often. And this led to many protests which forced the government to enact laws to regulate and also to force on laws and regulating conditions of work. Otherwise they were not going to do it, because government always wanted to only see the prosperity and the profit of what they got, and they were not really bothered about how and why these people led to revolts, or why these people often came up with upheavals. They were not really bothered about that. They were just concentrating and focusing on the profits which came their way. Now we have two different personalities given on this slide, and the first one is, the term Industrial Revolution was used initially by a European scholar, Georges Michelet in France and Frederick Engels in Germany. So I have highlighted this name because this is Georges Michelet and Frederick Engels. It is a name which is very common to you, and these two people coined this particular term. It was used for the first time in English by the philosopher and economist Arnold Toynbee. This is Arnold Toynbee, and he used it to describe the changes which Britain underwent, especially during this industrial phase between 1760 and 1820. It was used for the economic and philosophical changes which took place. And these dates obviously coincided with those of the reign of George III, and that is the date when Toynbee was giving a series of lectures at Oxford University, and he used this term also. It became very popular. His lectures got published in 1884 after his untimely death. When he was alive, nothing happened. It did not create much change, because there was a book called The Lectures on the Industrial Revolution in England, Popular Addresses, Notes and Other Fragments. This got published in 1884, and people started realizing the importance of this particular book, and also this term came into operation from then. There were other historians like T.S. Ashton, Paul Manteau and Eric Hobsbawm. They broadly agreed with the ethics and principles of Toynbee. They started propagating the principles of Toynbee even after his death. These are the three historians. The names are given here: Ashton, Manteau and Hobsbawm. The pictures are also given here for you to refer. There was a lot of economic growth which took place from the 1780s to 1820, especially in the cotton and iron industries, in coal mining, in the building of roads and canals, and Europe underwent a lot of changes, not only in its own country, not only in its own land, but the change was felt in and around Europe, not just in Europe. Around Europe also people got influenced. Ashton, this is Ashton, celebrated the Industrial Revolution when England was swept by a wave of gadgets. England saw the invention and revolution which was created because of the use of gadgets, electronics, communication, not like how we use it now, but because of that they termed, or they called it, the industrial phase in England. Now, why Britain? Why did Britain go through industrialization first? It was the first country to experience modern industrialization, and why not the others? Because there were other countries also who were equally powerful like Britain. It was very politically stable since the 17th century, and we also know that England, Wales and Scotland unified under a monarchy which was a very strict system. They were very stable, they were consistent in the execution of their laws, and nobody even dared to speak against the monarchy. This meant that this particular kingdom had common laws, a single currency and a market. There was no division, there were no territories, there were no boundaries. It was just one unified body where they were ruled by common laws, a single currency and market. And it was not at all fragmented by local authorities. That is what happened in India. India, very huge subcontinent, but was divided into several boundaries, several authorities were there. So there was no unity in the desires, needs and wants of the people. They were not even aware of what the people really needed. Okay, so fragmentation was not there in Britain, and that is why it was very easy to implement, or they underwent these changes very fast. And the taxes were not levied by the authorities which were fragmented or anything like that on goods that passed through their area, thus increasing their price. The only person to take decision was the monarch, or the monarchy was very strict with Britain, and was very easy to execute these kind of rules and regulations. So by the end of the 17th century, we saw that from 17th century itself, monarchy was unified. So from the 17th century itself, money was widely used as a medium of exchange, and that is when Britain really felt the change and started circulating the money as such. So by then, a large section of the people received their income. They started receiving their income in the form of wages and salaries. Money was rotated. It started getting circulated, okay? Rather than in goods. Instead of exchanging and receiving gifts, people started receiving wages and salaries for the first time, and that too after the process of industrialization. This also gave people more options and more choice for ways to spend their earnings. Because when you have products, when you get products in return, you will not have much options and choices. Now they knew how to spend on their earnings and expanded the market for the sale of goods. So once they got the earnings, they could buy anything of their choice, and they used the earnings to expand their market for the sale of goods. What happened in the 18th century? England had been through a major economic change. What was the change that England underwent? It was later described as the agricultural evolution, the agricultural revolution also, which evolved the whole of Britain. This was a process where the bigger landlords had brought up small farms near their own properties. This happened in France also. It enclosed village common lands, and they could monitor what was happening in their land, and they were creating very large estates and increasing food production. Everything was under the monitoring of these bigger landlords, and they kept people to work under them. They forced landless farmers. Britain was very expensive, so it was not very easy for the farmers to afford a land. And people who were living in these farmers, they did not have land, they did not own the land, that is the meaning. And it was very difficult for them to live there by grazing alone on the common lands. So they were forced to come and search for jobs and work in these bigger landlords' farms. Most of them went to nearby towns. They started working here and they received their wages and salary, and that is how the bigger landlords benefited from this kind of system. Now we have to talk about the most important part of this section, which is the towns, trade and finance. And that is why the Industrial Revolution prospered in Britain. From the 18th century, many towns in Europe were growing in area and in population, okay? Because we saw just now that people were forced to work in the bigger estates, which was owned by the landlords. And what happened? They were also working and getting wages and salaries, and many people started shifting to the nearby towns also. Out of the 19 European cities whose population doubled, the population doubled in 19 European cities between 1750 and 1800. 11 were in Britain. The largest of the city which got expanded was London, which was the hub of the country's market. It was the main center of the country's market, with next largest ones located close to it. So many people came for trade. People had more exposure when they came to London, and coming to London was like a trip from those days itself, because intermixture of people, trade and so many things could be found there. London acquired a lot of global significance because what you could not find elsewhere was found in London, because it was the main center which expanded under the expense of industrialization. By 18th century, something happened. The center of global trade had shifted from the Mediterranean ports of Italy and France. Global trade, the center was Mediterranean ports. We have been seeing this from the Islamic empire itself, right? The center of global trade. It slowly shifted from the Mediterranean ports to the Atlantic ports of Holland and Britain. So look at the shift. Over centuries, Mediterranean port was considered to be the thronging place of trade and commerce, but now it got shifted to Atlantic ports of Holland and Britain. So London replaced Amsterdam. Okay, so how did it replace? There are two main factors on how London replaced Amsterdam. It was the principal source of loans for international trade. It started giving loans for international trade. That was the first major change. It also became the most important center of trade, triangular trade network that drew in England, Africa, and the West Indies. So loans were given, and the main triangular trade center between these three places was London.